Judy Garland was just a girl when MGM handed her capsule bottles instead of freedom. Dean Martin kept the bottle close, and the world thought it was just an act. Cary Grant stepped into shadowy, psychedelic therapy rooms Hollywood never admitted existed. On screen, they were flawless, but off-screen their habits ranged from bizarre to tragic, from candy stashes to diamonds, from endless scrubbing to endless drinking. Here are 18 scandals the Golden Age tried to keep hidden. Number 1. Judy Garland, the pep pill prisoner. The spotlight loved Judy Garland, but it demanded a price she could never truly afford. Imagine a teenage girl, barely old enough to drive, sitting in a studio dressing room while a handler slid 2 bottles across the table. One filled with bright little pills to keep her awake, the other with capsules to force her to sleep. For Judy, this wasn't rebellion or choice. It was survival, the system's cruel prescription for a child who had been sold as a star. From the moment she signed with MGM in the late 1930s, her life became a cycle of chemical control. Long rehearsal days stretched into endless nights, and executives wanted their new darling tireless, sparkling, and thin. Pep pills for energy, sleeping pills for rest, diet pills to keep the weight off, all swallowed under the cold fluorescent light of studio control. At first, she believed it was just what every professional did. By the time she realized it was a trap, she was already caught. Her voice could stop a nation. In 1939, she gave the world over the rainbow. But what the public didn't see was the rainbow-colored pillbox in her bag. The more she worked, the more she needed them. And the more she needed them, the less they worked. She confessed later that she never knew how to live without them. Friends would recall Judy trembling backstage, her smile forced wide enough to hide the exhaustion in her eyes. The cruelest irony was that the same studio that manufactured her addiction also built her legend. MGM marketed her as the girl next door, fresh-faced and wholesome. But behind closed doors, she was already fighting demons they had slipped into her bloodstream. As she aged, the dependence only deepened. Pills became a comfort, a prison, and eventually a poison. By the time she tried to reclaim her life in concerts and television specials, her body bore the scars of decades in chemical chains. Hollywood crowned her as its eternal child star. Yet for Judy Garland, the truest story was not her voice, but the silence she sought in bottles of little pills. Number 2. Marilyn Monroe, chasing sleep in a bottle. The world remembers Marilyn Monroe as the woman who lit up every room. A vision of glamour with a smile that could melt steel. But when the cameras stopped, nights became her greatest enemy. Insomnia haunted her like a shadow, each dark hour stretching into an eternity of restless tossing. To silence her racing mind, she turned to bottles of sleeping pills, tiny capsules of escape that promised the peace she could never find in her own bed. From the early 1950s, as her fame grew uncontrollable, Marilyn's private hours shrank. Studios pushed her to arrive flawless. Lovers demanded her attention, and gossip columns circled like vultures. Her mind could never switch off. Friends described her pacing, chain-smoking cigarettes, whispering fears into the night. Doctors prescribed barbiturates, assuring her they would bring relief. She believed them. And soon, the habit became ritual. A single pill at first, then 2. Later, entire handfuls just to drift into a dreamless sleep. On film sets, she would arrive late, groggy, struggling to shake off the chemical fog. Directors fumed, but no one dared challenge the star who kept the box office alive. Marilyn herself knew the truth. The very cure she relied upon was stealing her clarity, her energy, her joy. Yet, when the lights dimmed, she could not let them go. Heartbreak only deepened the cycle. Failed marriages to Joe DiMaggio and Arthur Miller left her lonelier than ever, and the public scrutiny magnified every wound. In interviews, she admitted she feared being left alone at night. The pills weren't luxury. They were armor, a fragile lifeline against the silence. By the early 1960s, Her dependence had become legend among those closest to her. She carried bottles wherever she went, treating them as necessary as lipstick or perfume. And in August of 1962, it was in a bedroom littered with pill vials that Marilyn Monroe was found lifeless at just 36. Number 3. Cary Grant. Psychedelics and the search for himself to the public. Cary Grant was perfection incarnate, tall, tailored, and effortlessly charming. He was the man every woman wanted, and every man wanted to be. Yet behind that immaculate tuxedo was a man who confessed he felt like an imposter in his own skin. And unlike his peers who dulled their pain with whiskey or pills, Grant went searching for answers in a far stranger place, a vial of liquid lysergic acid. In the late 1950s, long before LSD was outlawed, the drug was quietly studied in California as a tool for psychedelic therapy. To Grant, it was not a wild experiment, but a path toward clarity. Friends recalled him arriving at discreet clinics in Los Angeles, settling into dim rooms where psychiatrists guided him through trips designed not for pleasure, but for peeling back layers of his identity. What he found there, he later described in glowing terms. The experiences, he said, freed him from decades of buried trauma, childhood poverty in England, a mother institutionalized when he was a boy, and the crushing weight of Hollywood's constant performance. "All my life I ran up steps 2 at a time," he once confessed, "to prove I was worthy." Under psychedelics, he claimed, he finally felt still. Cary Grant underwent more than 60 sessions. He spoke candidly about them in interviews, insisting the visions granted him self-knowledge he could not achieve through ordinary means. He credited the drug with helping him confront insecurities, soften his ego, even approach relationships with more honesty. Yet, Hollywood whispered, psychedelics were already gaining a reputation as a dangerous hallucinogen, tied to counterculture and rebellion. Grant's use was different, but the association was risky. Still, he never apologized. To him, the sessions were medicine, not madness. The irony was stark. The man who played suave heroes on screen felt broken within, and the studios that relied on his image had no idea their leading man was unraveling his psyche in secret laboratories. For Cary Grant, psychedelics were not a party. It was a desperate mirror, reflecting the truth beneath a face the world refused to doubt. Number 4. Clark Gable, chewing gum to survive stardom. Clark Gable was known as the King of Hollywood, the unshakable rogue who swept women off their feet in Gone with the Wind. But even kings have their quirks. For Gable, the pressure of stardom, endless interviews, million-dollar sets, and eyes watching his every move, came with a secret coping tool, a simple stick of chewing gum. On set, crew members often noticed him slipping a piece into his mouth just before the cameras rolled. It wasn't vanity or indulgence, it was survival. The gum calmed his nerves, steadied his breath, and gave him something to grind against when anxiety threatened to crack the mask of confidence. More than once, directors were forced to halt a take because Gable had forgotten to spit it out, delivering lines of romance or fury with his jaw working furiously in the corner of the frame. For a man who seemed larger than life, this tiny habit revealed something more fragile. Hollywood demanded that Gable always appear invincible, the strong soldier, the rugged lover, the man who never faltered. But the truth was that he carried a constant undercurrent of tension. Chewing gum became his shield, a ritual that allowed him to face the lights, the scripts, and the expectations without breaking. Friends joked about it. Studio bosses rolled their eyes, yet no one dared pry the habit from him. To take away his gum was to strip him of the one anchor that reminded him he was still human beneath the costume of a legend. The irony is poignant. Gable's audiences believed him untouchable, yet the world's greatest leading man leaned on the same nervous crutch as a schoolboy before a speech. Every stick of gum chewed was a reminder that even Hollywood's kings fought private battles with fear. Number 5. Vivien Leigh. Tranquilizers behind the curtain. Vivien Leigh was immortalized as Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. Fiery, flawless, and seemingly unbreakable. But away from the screen, the actress fought a relentless private war. Her true adversary wasn't a rival star or a ruthless studio boss. It was her own mind. Battling what we now recognize as bipolar disorder, Leigh endured cycles of euphoria and despair that left her drained, vulnerable, and searching for something, anything, to hold her world together. Doctors of the time had little understanding of her condition, and the prescriptions they offered were blunt instruments, tranquilizers. These pills promised quiet, promising to smooth the jagged edges of her moods. For Leigh, they became both a cushion and a cage. Between roles, she relied on them to silence the storms raging inside, to steady her when the highs became too dizzying and the lows sank too deep. Her colleagues noticed the changes. On stage and set, she could be radiant one day and withdrawn the next, her performances swinging between brilliance and collapse. Laurence Olivier, her husband for nearly 2 decades, watched helplessly as the woman he adored disappeared behind waves of exhaustion and medicated haze. Yet the show had to go on, and so did the pills. The tragedy of Vivien's struggle was not only the toll it took on her health, but how Hollywood responded. Studios wanted her at her best, but they were unwilling to grapple with the truth of her illness. Instead, they quietly tolerated her dependence, whispering about nerves and fragility, while offering little more than another prescription bottle. Even as the tranquilizers dulled her pain, they also dulled her spark. Friends recalled her longing for freedom from the chemical leash. Yet without them, she was left defenseless against the roaring swings of her disorder. It was a cruel paradox. The very medicine that kept her functioning also stole parts of her fire. Number 6. Joan Crawford. The tyranny of cleanliness. Joan Crawford's screen presence was ferocious, a star who embodied strength, sophistication, and unshakable will. Yet in her private life, she waged a quieter, obsessive battle. For Crawford, control was not just an image she projected on screen. It was something she demanded in every corner of her world, and her chosen weapon was cleanliness. Friends and staff recalled how her home gleamed like a showroom. Floors had to shine like mirrors. Surfaces were polished until they sparkled, and every object had its place. A misplaced book or a smudge on glass could spark an outburst. She scrubbed and dusted with the intensity of someone fighting an invisible enemy. For Joan, the ritual wasn't simply about hygiene. It was about order, a way to impose calm on a life forever teetering on chaos. Hollywood was a world she could never truly control. Studios dictated roles. Critics judged performances. Gossip columnists dissected her personal life. But in her own home, she ruled with unyielding precision. Cleaning became her therapy, her sanctuary, her way of proving that some things, at least the shine of a floor or the crispness of a sheet, would bend to her will. Those closest to her often described the contradiction. On set, Crawford exuded glamour, draped in gowns and diamonds. At home, she could be found on her knees with a brush in hand, scouring tiles as if her career depended on it. Some whispered it bordered on compulsion, a nervous energy channeled into polishing and scrubbing. To outsiders, it might have seemed absurd. One of the most powerful actresses of her era, battling dust bunnies with the ferocity of a general. But beneath the obsession lay a truth. Joan Crawford's world was built on image, and image demanded perfection. If she could not control the studios, the critics, or the betrayals of lovers, she would control her home. Spotless, ordered, flawless. Her addiction was not to pills or whiskey, but to polish and bleach. For Joan Crawford, the tyranny of cleanliness was her shield against the chaos of fame. A fragile empire kept shining one scrub at a time. Number 7. James Dean. Living fast, dying fast. James Dean embodied rebellion like no one else. With a leather jacket slung over his shoulder and a cigarette hanging from his lips, he became the symbol of youth unchained. Yet the image was more than a role. It was his life. Dean carried an obsession with speed, danger, and machines that roared louder than the applause. Cars were not just possessions to him. They were extensions of his spirit. Engines that allowed him to outrun the stillness he feared most. From his earliest days in Hollywood, Dean sought the thrill of the racetrack. He collected fast cars, Porsches, Triumphs, MGs, each one more powerful than the last. Between filming Rebel Without a Cause and East of Eden, he spent weekends burning rubber on California roads, chasing adrenaline at speeds most wouldn't dare. Friends described him as restless, unable to sit still unless the world blurred by his window. Racing was both escape and addiction. On the track, Dean wasn't a movie star or a studio property. He was a man in control of his own fate, carving curves with reckless grace. Yet the very freedom he craved carried a shadow. Studios begged him to stop, warning that his dangerous hobby threatened his rising career. Dean only laughed, insisting that if he couldn't race, he couldn't breathe. That defiance ended tragically. On September 30th, 1955, Dean climbed into his silver Porsche 550 Spider, nicknamed Little Bastard, for what was supposed to be a short drive to a race in Salinas. Hours later, on a lonely stretch of highway, he collided with another car at high speed. The wreck mangled the vehicle and claimed his life instantly. He was only 24. Hollywood mourned a rebel gone too soon, but the truth was crueler. James Dean's need for speed was not a pastime. It was a compulsion, an obsession that carried him to immortality and into the grave in one final, furious burst of velocity. His legend would forever be tied to the roar of engines and the silence that followed. Number 8. Elizabeth Taylor. Diamonds as a drug. Elizabeth Taylor's violet eyes and tempestuous romances made her the eternal queen of Hollywood drama. Yet behind the gossip and the glamour lay another passion that bordered on obsession. For Taylor, jewels were not mere accessories. They were lifelines, trophies, even therapy. Diamonds, rubies, emeralds. She collected them as if they could shield her from heartbreak, as if every carat could anchor a soul that lived in constant upheaval. Her love affair with jewelry began early, but it reached mythic proportions once she became one of the highest-paid actresses of the 1950s and 60s. Studios paid her fortunes, and Taylor funneled that fortune into gems. She amassed treasures like the 69-carat Taylor Burton diamond and the historic La Peregrina pearl, gifted by Richard Burton during their famously stormy marriage. For the world, it was glamorous excess. For Elizabeth, it was compulsion. Friends recalled her cradling necklaces like fragile children, slipping on diamond rings as if they were armor before stepping onto a red carpet. Each gem became more than sparkle. It was proof she was adored, desired, and above all, untouchable. When relationships crumbled, when scandals filled newspapers, the jewels remained, glittering constants in a life of chaos. She joked that big girls needed big diamonds, but the humor masked a deeper truth. Collecting became a cycle of craving and reward. The jewels gave her a rush, a high not unlike the substances or vices that trapped so many of her peers. She wasn't merely wearing wealth, she was feeding an addiction. By the time she was older, her jewelry collection was estimated in the hundreds of millions. Yet even then, she confessed the sparkle was never enough. "You can't cry on a diamond's shoulder," she once said, a line drenched in irony from the woman who seemed to cradle them as confidants. Number 9. Dean Martin. Whiskey with a wink. Dean Martin made it look effortless. Whether crooning with the Rat Pack at the Sands Hotel or trading jokes with Frank Sinatra on late-night television, he seemed forever relaxed. Glass in hand, a grin never far from his lips. To audiences, it was an act. The lovable lush, the man who always had one more joke and one more drink. But for Dean, the whiskey wasn't a prop. It was his quiet companion, his constant ritual on stage and off. The public adored the image. Whiskey gave Martin a signature cool, the liquid thread weaving together his persona of charm and nonchalance. He could raise a glass mid-song, sip between verses, and make it feel like the most natural thing in the world. Fans laughed, thinking it was all performance. Yet friends knew the glass rarely left his hand when the lights dimmed. In smoky lounges after shows, in his private dressing rooms, even at home, the bottle was never far from reach. Unlike some peers who drank to obliteration, Martin was subtle, steady. He was rarely sloppy or staggering. Instead, whiskey was his steady fuel, smoothing rough edges, softening his restlessness. Behind the smile, he carried insecurities about his talent, his fame, his place in Sinatra's shadow. The whiskey dulled those questions, letting him glide through nights with that famous wink. But dependency grows quietly. Over time, his reliance deepened, shaping not only his image, but his health. Directors noted the haze in his performances. Friends worried about the toll on his body. Yet to the public, Dean Martin remained untouchable, the king of cool, his voice honeyed, his glass raised in eternal toast. Number 10. Errol Flynn, Addicted to Danger. Errol Flynn leapt across screens as cinema's ultimate swashbuckler, the dashing rogue in Captain Blood and the adventures of Robin Hood. But those sword fights and ship battles weren't just fiction. For Flynn, danger was not a role, it was his oxygen. From the start of his career, he craved adrenaline the way others craved applause. Sailing stormy seas, fencing with real blades, chasing women and whiskey with equal ferocity. He lived each day like the final act of a grand adventure. Friends joked that he was incapable of sitting still, always seeking the next thrill, the next risk, the next scandal that would set Hollywood whispering. His appetite for danger extended far beyond the studio gates. He bought yachts and set off into storms, daring the ocean to swallow him whole. He climbed mountains, hunted big game, and surrounded himself with the chaos of fast living. At parties, his exploits bordered on reckless legend. Brawls, affairs, and indulgences that pushed boundaries no other star dared cross. Where others saw peril, Flynn saw life at its brightest. The studios tried to rein him in. Warner Brothers reminded him of contracts, begged him to tone down the antics that risked lawsuits and headlines. But Flynn shrugged off their warnings. To deny him danger was to deny him breath. Even as his career waned in the 1940s, he doubled down on risk-taking, chasing youth and vitality through increasingly reckless choices. And while danger made him magnetic, it also left scars. His health deteriorated, his reputation sank, and the heroic image on screen gave way to a troubled, scandal-ridden reality. By his early 50s, years of pushing limits had aged him decades. Still, to the end, Flynn remained unapologetic. "It isn't what they say about you," he once remarked. "It's what they whisper." And whisper they did. His addiction was not to fame, not even to vice, but to danger itself, the pulse that kept his heart beating until it finally stopped. Number 11. Jean Harlow. Bleached into a persona. Long before Marilyn Monroe, there was Jean Harlow, Hollywood's original platinum blonde. She lit up the 1930s with a smile as bright as the silver screen itself, earning the nickname the Blonde Bombshell. But her dazzling hair was no natural gift. It was the product of an obsession, a relentless ritual of bleach, peroxide, and pain that consumed her life. Harlow understood that image was power. MGM molded her into a symbol of desire, and her platinum hair became her trademark. To keep it that way, she endured treatments that would make modern stylists shudder. Week after week, peroxide and ammonia were poured over her scalp, stripping every hint of color until her hair gleamed white under the lights. The process left burns, brittleness, and breakage, but Jean persisted. For her, Peroxide wasn't beauty care. It was survival in a business that thrived on image. Friends recalled her joking that her real addiction wasn't fame. It was bleach. She scheduled her days around touch-ups, obsessing over roots that threatened to betray the illusion. Photographers were under strict orders never to capture her in shadow, where her hair might appear dull. Every public appearance was calculated to maintain the fantasy, even as the reality left her scalp raw and her health at risk. The irony was cruel. Beneath the peroxide shimmer was a young woman desperate to be seen as more than a hair color. She wanted complex roles, to be respected as an actress, not just a spectacle. Yet the studios had no interest in Jean Harlow, the woman. They wanted Jean Harlow, the platinum goddess, and the bleach ensured they got her. By the time she died tragically at just 26, her platinum halo had already become legend. The look she crafted through obsessive rituals outlived her, influencing generations of actresses who followed. Jean Harlow's addiction was not to pills or whiskey, but to an image, a relentless, shimmering mask maintained with peroxide, one bottle at a time. Number 12. Humphrey Bogart, chess over cigarettes. Humphrey Bogart is remembered as Hollywood's ultimate tough guy, the trench-coated detective in The Maltese Falcon, the world-weary romantic in Casablanca. Audiences saw him with a cigarette dangling from his lips, that gravelly voice cutting through the smoke. But what few realized was that Bogart's truest obsession wasn't nicotine, it was chess. To Bogart, the board was more than a pastime. It was a battlefield, a place where strategy and wit decided fates. He carried chess sets from set to set, tucking them into dressing rooms and trailers so that no idle moment went unplayed. Crew members and co-stars often found themselves challenged to a quick match, and rarely did anyone escape without being soundly defeated. The obsession bordered on compulsion. At parties, while others drank and danced, Bogart would set up pieces in a corner, scanning the board with the same intensity he gave to a film script. Even in the heat of production, he sometimes disappeared during breaks, absorbed in games against assistants, fellow actors, or even himself, replaying famous moves he'd memorized from books. Friends teased him about it, but Bogart didn't care. For a man constantly typecast as a loner or anti-hero, chess provided a rare space of control and certainty. On the board, he could outthink, outmaneuver, and claim victory without the meddling of studios or critics. Each match was a rebellion against the roles he was forced to play. The irony is striking. While Hollywood immortalized Bogart as the chain-smoking cynic, his true addiction was intellectual, not chemical. The cigarette was a prop, but the chessboard was his lifeline. It sharpened his mind, soothed his nerves, and gave him an escape from the chaos of stardom. Even late in life, Bogart confessed that the game meant more to him than most of the characters he played. Chess, in its quiet intensity, reflected who he really was. A man who lived by strategy, timing, and the patience to wait for the perfect move. Number 13. Lucille Ball, Caffeine. As lifeline, Lucille Ball was a whirlwind of energy, the queen of comedy whose timing could split a room with laughter. From her wide-eyed slapstick in I Love Lucy to her groundbreaking role as the first woman to run a major television studio, she seemed unstoppable. But behind the brilliance was a secret fuel that kept her motor running: coffee. Gallons of it. Lucille's schedule was relentless. Long rehearsal days stretched into late-night rewrites, followed by early morning call times. While others collapsed from exhaustion, she reached for another cup. Colleagues swore that her dressing rooms and offices always smelled of strong brew, and assistants learned to keep fresh pots on standby. Coffee wasn't just a drink to Lucy. It was her lifeline, the pulse that kept her comedic genius firing. She turned it into ritual. Mornings began with multiple cups before she even left the house. Afternoons were fueled by another round, sipped between costume fittings and script edits. By evening rehearsals, she often had a mug in hand, the steam curling into her already electric energy. Friends joked that caffeine was her real co-star, as essential to her success as Desi Arnaz or the laugh track. But her dependence went deeper than habit. Lucy carried immense pressure, not just as a performer, but as a businesswoman pioneering new territory for women in Hollywood. Every decision, every punchline, every financial risk weighed on her. Coffee sharpened her edge, kept her mind racing when others would have faltered. It gave her focus when the world demanded perfection. Number 14. Bette Davis. A cigarette in every frame. Few stars commanded the screen like Bette Davis. With her sharp eyes, clipped delivery, and force-of-nature presence, she became one of Hollywood's most respected actresses. But her legendary rasp, the voice that carried icy insults and fiery monologues, wasn't a gift of birth. It was steeped in tobacco smoke, drawn from a habit that became inseparable from her identity. On and off set, Davis smoked as if it were part of the script. Between takes, a cigarette was always perched in her hand, its ember glowing in the shadows. Interviews show her exhaling through a smile, unbothered by the haze surrounding her. Crew members recalled entire scenes clouded in smoke, forcing directors to halt filming until the air cleared. To Bette, it wasn't disruption, it was ritual. The cigarette was more than a prop. It was a weapon. In an industry that often sought to soften women, Davis leaned into her defiance. A plume of smoke became punctuation to her authority, an exclamation mark after every cutting remark. Her raspy voice, that unforgettable growl, turned into an accidental trademark, giving her roles a toughness no script could teach. Yet, as with so many Hollywood fixations, the cost was steep. Davis herself admitted to the habit's grip, smoking through stress, through triumph, through heartbreak. When studio executives cornered her about her behavior, she responded with the same sharp wit that made her famous, brushing off concerns with a flick of ash. Friends noted that her cigarette breaks weren't just indulgence, they were her anchor. In moments of tension, lighting up gave her a sense of control, a pause in a world that demanded constant intensity. But behind the glamour, the addiction quietly carved at her health, even as it burnished her legend. Number 15. Orson Welles. Drowning stress in drink. Orson Welles was a prodigy who conquered Hollywood before he was 26. With Citizen Kane, he rewrote the language of cinema. Yet for all his brilliance, Welles carried a burden that genius alone could not soothe. Behind his booming voice and towering presence, he turned again and again to alcohol, a chosen fuel that dulled his stress, even as it deepened his decline. The pressures began early. Studios resented his independence, critics dissected his work, and financial backers pulled away from his ambitious projects. Welles lived in a constant storm of creation and conflict. To quiet it, he poured a glass. Wine, brandy, bourbon, the drink didn't matter so long as it offered momentary calm. Friends recalled evenings where he dominated dinner tables, a raconteur with endless stories, always with a glass in hand. Drinking became as much a part of his persona as his velvet voice. It helped him play the role of the bon vivant, the larger-than-life artist whose appetites matched his talent. But when the laughter faded and the crowd dispersed, the bottle remained. The irony is haunting. Alcohol sharpened his charm in public, but in private, it often dulled his discipline. Projects were abandoned, deadlines slipped, and the same mind that once revolutionized cinema became scattered under the haze. Even those who adored him admitted the drink was both his prop and his prison. Still, Welles defended his indulgence with characteristic wit. He insisted a stiff drink fueled his creativity, gave him courage in the face of constant rejection. To some extent, it was true. His most enduring work came from a man who thrived on excess, who believed art required sacrifice. But beneath the bravado was a man numbing wounds too deep to admit. By his later years, his girth and his glass became symbols of indulgence. Yet when he spoke, his brilliance still flickered, proof that the drink never erased the genius, only blurred it. Orson Welles left the world masterpieces, but also a caution. Even brilliance can drown when its fuel becomes its undoing. Number 16. Greta Garbo. Addicted to isolation. Greta Garbo captivated the world with a single glance. Her face, pale, sculpted, eternal, turned silence into poetry on the silver screen. Yet while audiences begged for more, Garbo longed for less. She was Hollywood's greatest enigma, an actress who craved not fame or applause, but solitude. Isolation wasn't her retreat, it was her addiction. From the height of her stardom in the 1930s, Garbo resisted the machinery of Hollywood. She avoided interviews, shunned premieres, and recoiled from publicity stunts. "I want to be alone," she famously declared, a line that became both her screen catchphrase and her life's manifesto. Unlike her peers, who thrived on attention, Garbo treated privacy like oxygen. The moment the spotlight burned too hot, she stepped back into the shadows. Her obsession with solitude grew as her career soared. After the triumph of films like Grand Hotel and Camille, she abruptly withdrew, retreating to her Manhattan apartment, where curtains were drawn and doors were rarely opened. Friends and neighbors described her as almost ghostly, spotted only on solitary walks through Central Park, or disguised in sunglasses and scarves to avoid recognition. It wasn't laziness or arrogance, it was compulsion. Garbo meticulously guarded her private hours, refusing scripts, turning down interviews, declining offers that would have cemented her as the reigning queen of cinema. While Hollywood built careers on constant visibility, Garbo built hers on disappearance. The world speculated endlessly. Was it fear, insecurity, or mystery cultivated on purpose? Perhaps it was all of them. But what's clear is that isolation gave her a sense of control no studio could buy. Alone, she wasn't Greta Garbo, the star. She was simply herself. In the end, her withdrawal only deepened her legend. Garbo became a myth, a phantom draped in silence, remembered as much for what she denied the public as for what she gave them. Her addiction wasn't to pills or alcohol, but to solitude, a craving so strong it outlived her fame, leaving behind an actress who slipped away by choice, one step ahead of the spotlight. Number 17. Lana Turner. Shopping as salvation. Lana Turner was Hollywood's blonde goddess, a discovery at a soda fountain who rose to become the epitome of glamour. To the public, she seemed untouchable, a woman draped in mink and diamonds, forever glowing under studio lights. But behind the facade, Turner battled a lifetime of turmoil, failed marriages, public scandals, and the crushing loneliness of fame. Her chosen escape was not a bottle or a pill, but the glittering aisles of department stores. Shopping became her salvation. For Lana, retail therapy wasn't frivolous. It was survival. Whenever heartbreak or stress threatened to overwhelm her, she sought comfort in boutiques along Rodeo Drive or the grand halls of Beverly Hills' luxury shops. Friends remembered her disappearing for hours, returning with armfuls of dresses, handbags, and shoes, each purchase a temporary bandage over deeper wounds. The studio system only encouraged the habit. MGM presented Turner as the ultimate glamour queen, always adorned in the latest fashions. Off-screen, she mirrored that image, filling closets with gowns and accessories so extensive they rivaled costume departments. Shopping gave her a sense of control, a way to design her own armor against the gossip columns that dissected every affair, every headline. Her life was anything but orderly. A string of turbulent relationships left her vulnerable, and tragedy shadowed her career. Most infamously, the 1958 incident, where her daughter Cheryl fatally stabbed Turner's abusive boyfriend, Johnny Stompanato. In the wake of scandal, Lana returned again to stores, building beauty around herself as the world threatened to collapse. To outsiders, it seemed like excess, but to Lana, each purchase was a reminder that she could still choose, still create, still claim some corner of joy in a life where studios, men, and tabloids tried to strip it away. Number 18. Rock Hudson, Sweet Tooth Secrets. Rock Hudson was the picture of American masculinity, tall, broad-shouldered, and smiling with the kind of effortless charm that made him one of Hollywood's most bankable leading men. On screen, he was the rugged hero or the romantic dream, but in private, Hudson carried a secret craving far removed from the Hollywood ideal. His comfort wasn't found in whiskey, women, or scandal. It was in sugar, candy bars, chocolate, hard candies, small, sweet indulgences that became his constant companions. Colleagues often noticed his pockets rattling with treats on set, a quick escape between takes when nerves tightened or fatigue set in. Directors teased him for sneaking bites of chocolate before kissing scenes, while friends laughed at how his eyes lit up like a child's when offered dessert. What seemed like a harmless quirk was, for Hudson, something deeper. Sugar was solace. The demands of stardom weighed heavily. Maintaining his leading man image meant relentless studio grooming, forced romances for publicity, and a carefully constructed persona that left little room for his true self. In that pressure cooker, candy became an innocent rebellion, a private indulgence that no studio boss could dictate. Unlike alcohol or pills, sweets gave him temporary comfort without dulling his charm. But the habit followed him everywhere. Friends recalled late-night binges, stacks of candy wrappers discarded in hotel rooms after long days of press tours. In those moments, Hudson wasn't the matinee idol. He was simply a man trying to soothe the loneliness of a carefully hidden life. Hollywood's golden glow hid shadows of obsession, addiction, and fragile humanity. These stars gave us dreams, but their secrets remind us of the cost of fame. Share your thoughts below. Which one shocked you the most? And join us by liking and subscribing. More untold stories await in the flicker of the past.